Hey guys, and welcome to the second subpart of part 7, where we initially covered widget testing. Where like the first subpart, if you remember from the previous part of the series, is we covered widget testing. So that essentially dealt with, like async operations to the point where we bind the data. But in this second subpart, this time we'll be focusing on the user interactions with the widgets, whether that's like tapping a widget, dragging, or inputting text. We covered this part before, so the introduction to widget testing and the Flutter docs, and then as far as finding an assertion for a widget, this doc covered here, and then this time we'll be looking into this part of the docs, as it says here in the title, where it mentions the types of widget interactions. All right, so before we get into that, as always, I have the branch pushed out. It's titled Flutter Tutorial Part 7.2 branch. So as always, we'll be branched off of the previous one, in this case 7.1, and then work our way up against the second subpart. All right, so let's get started. So here's the first part of the widget tests we worked on, covering the last part. So if I open up the simulator here, remember that we have a mocked out data, right? In this case, some dummy title called something like text article title, and then some published time the article is published ago, and basically asserted against that, right? So fortunately, our next tests for widget interactions will be kind of similar to the test we have here, but with a little more flavor, such that we actually add the interactions with the widgets and go as far as asserting them. So as usual, we could do our usual copy and pasta over to a new test file. So maybe we could call something like headline interaction widget test.dart. Okay, so paste that bad boy in here. Okay, so as you guys probably remember, we have our mocked out client here that basically implements our news API repo, right, of the get call for top headlines. So we'll obviously hold on to this, as we'll be needing it for the widget tests. All right, and then we have our group block here of all the corresponding tests. Why don't we rename that now to be more applicable, like use loaded headline article data to test out widget interactions. Okay, and then we'll be holding on to this setup function block here, right? So if you remember correctly, we have our mocked out initial values for the shared preferences for caching, which is basically a news source pref key, right? Because we're defaulting to Google News before we pass it into the get call. All right, and then for these existing tests, we could maybe hold on to something useful. In this case, maybe something like this, right? Because it gives us mocked out headline data of the article. So why don't we get rid of these for now? Okay. All right, so opening up the simulator, I was thinking the first test interaction we could try is, so remember that we have our list of articles here, and then, right, scrollable, and then if you open one, basically it renders a full screen web view, right? That we could like view this article in more detail. So why don't we try test against that? Okay, so for starters, we can maybe rename this to something like taps on a loaded article item to view its web view. Okay, we'll be holding on to these. All right, so the notable change for this mocked out object we have here is basically we'll need a URL property, right? That basically gets passed into our helper web view widget. Okay, so this takes in a URL, and then if I open up this article model, right, it takes a URL here. So here's like a sample Postman response. something like that, as you'd expect. This is the article URL. So in this case, we could like maybe pass in a placeholder URL. Google for now, right? Because we just need to assure that the web view is open once tapping it. All right, so we'll hold on to these as well. We'll need this initial pump widget function to render out the frames and animations and whatnot. And then this pump and settle to make sure that the remaining frames are all rendered out properly. And then the assertions here we could hold on to. Basically assures that the empty state doesn't exist such that we actually have data, right? So in this case, the article title, and it's found by the text widget with this name, right? So we could hold on to those for now, and then for the other tests to come. All right, so as you'd expect, we just want to have a tap interaction, right? Somehow to tap one of these items in the list. Okay, so going back to the docs. All right, so if you go to tap, drag, and enter text docs here, right, notice that they'll get some samples here we could reference. And then if you skip down to number 3, the widget tester, right, parameter within the test widgets function, we could reference that to invoke the tap function, right? Given we use the finder class to find the widget, whether it's by type or text or key, what have you. So why don't we copy this for now? Something like this, await tester.tap. And then we could decide which finder function or helper function to use to pass in the corresponding widget. But it'd help if we could go back to our main.dart file, right? Going down this these lines of code, we could reference where exactly it's being tapped, right? So here's our helper web view widget here. Here's the article.url. And then basically the on-tap callback of the list tile class is handling the logic, right? To push in a new navigator stack of the web view, right? So why don't we reference this list tile class? So we could find dot by type, right? Like how we pasted it in here, and then pass in list tile. Okay. So now that we have the interaction in place here, we got to make our next pump function, right? To pump it in and then make sure that it's actually rendered into the device. So the frames, you could, as you'd expect, there's like many frames animations going on here, right? First, the new stack that's being pushed upon here, and then how the web view gets loaded, right? So we could just simply use the pump and settle function, right? Like we did before. And then we can make our actual assertions here. Basically, we want to make sure that the web view is displayed. Okay, so basically, we can get all creative now for the sake of this tutorial. Is maybe, all right, so going back to the find widgets doc. All right, so we could either find by the name of the string of the text widget, or by specific key. Okay, so in this case, if we go over to our helper web view widget, we could just assign it a random key of, say, something like key helper web view widget. Okay, maybe copy this, and then find dot by key. Simply pass that in, and then finds one widget. Oops, forgot to pass it into the constructor here. All right, cool. So we'll be debugging this as we did before. Just set up our respective breakpoints for each line of code, and then we also want to not only set breakpoints on the tests, but actually through the app. So some good placements would be maybe like here, there. Okay, and then definitely the tap interaction to actually push out the web view stack. And then maybe a breakpoint here, just to make sure that the scaffold widget gets built for this widget. Okay, I think that's enough breakpoints for now. If not, we could add as we go. Okay, so why don't we try debugging this now? All right, so as you remember, we just call this before each of our tests. All right, mock out the get call for mock.models, pumped initial widget, and the pumped initial widget, basically looking at a sync op snapshot here. It's still in the loading state. So with that, we fire off the progress bar initially. Okay, and then pump and settle to settle the remaining frames and animations. All right, and then we're passing the dummy headline data. Right? So we'll notice that looking at our properties here, now we have the URL property, right, being used, in this case, the placeholder google.com, all right, which will be helpful in this case. Okay, keep going down, and then here's our article from the headline object. All right, just to assert that we don't have the empty state being shown, and then there's at least one widget, the text widget with this title here. Okay, and then here's the tap interaction where we basically tap the list tile. All right, so fortunately that worked. Our breakpoint was fired here in the callback. Okay, renders out the widget once the pump and settle is fired off. And there it is. It's being built, and here notice that the URL is successfully passed with the app bar title, which is not really relevant to the test, but it's an FYI. And then we assert, basically, like I said, that the web view actually is rendered. Okay, and test results say passed. Okay, cool. So that's that. Okay, so we covered so that's one interaction we could test, right? Another which we can test is, so considering that this is a list view, right? Another feature of this list is basically if you scroll down far enough, right? Notice that we have the refresh indicator, and then if we let go, basically the swipe to refresh callback is fired, right? In this case, the on refresh callback here asynchronously makes the get call again, right? Could set our breakpoint here just to make sure that the callback is actually fired. So for now, let's copy and paste what we have here, because most of what we have already is going to be quite similar. So before I forget, why don't we rename the name of this test just to be on good hands, to something like swipe list view to refresh article data. So these will be the same, with the exception of these. All right, so just think of like what we have here thus far as like a template for our widget tests. All right, cool. So going back to the docs, for the interactions, for dragging, so we covered tapping, right? Now this is going to handle dragging, where basically in this docs, it mentions like how to fire off the drag function, right, from the widget tester to basically swipe to dismiss an action, right? For the sample we have here, it's basically a list that has a list of to-do items, and you just swipe it one by one from left to right. Okay, so basically, why don't we copy and paste this here for starters. So going to our main.dart file here, the onRefresh is a property within the refresh indicator class. So we need to interact with this widget in particular, right? So just to spice things up, we'll give this a key. Maybe call something like key headline refresh indicator widget, comma. Right. So let's instead make this find by key string with the key's name. Oh, again, I forgot the key object with the constructor here. It's a string. Okay, so basically, given the widget that was found, right, that we passed in by key, there's what's called the offset, right? That's basically the Cartesian coordinates, right? X, Y coordinate plane. We want to basically change this. So notice that here's on the X coordinates, right? So 500 for the X coordinate value. But in our case, we could change it to something like, we could change it to 500 for the Y coordinate, considering that to drag down far enough, right, to actually invoke the refresh logic, right? So just to stay sane, why don't we test to see if that works, just to see if the onRefresh callback was actually fired. All right, so we've got our breakpoints here. Okay, debug this. Okay, for the get call, pump the widgets. Snapshots of the headline data, successful. The templated assertions, and then the drag. All right, of course, forgot to pump the widget. So considering that there will be many frames or animations when like dragging this down to drop and then the new list of data to render afterwards, right? Let's invoke pump settle. And so basically as a race condition, right, for the second mocked out call to handle the refresh callback logic, we want to, for a mocked API repo instance, right, with the mock clients we have up here. So notice that it gets passed in to this main widget here, right, where this mocked repo gets used accordingly throughout the widgets. We want to basically call this before this is called, right, just to like pass in the mocked response. So in our case, it'll be a different return response compared to this one. So for now, we could just copy and paste this into down here. And then maybe keep it simple and just like update the title, right? And then pump and settle. Just, you know, run the animation or schedule animations of the frames, which will basically fire this soon after we mock out the get call. Okay. And then we just make our assertion here. We could just maybe find by text widget with the enclosed text name of this, and then finds one widget and debug. All right, so I'll explain everything as we go. All right, so we have our shared preferences key to reference of Google News, first mocked out call, the initial pump for the widget. All right, so renders out the list of articles. Okay, and then, so here's the old one, or the first one rather, of initial title of the article. All right, continue firing each breakpoint. So same old, and then the templated assertions, and then the drag interaction, and then the second mocked out call. So it'll give us this new response that's basically a refresh, right? So pump and settle, notice that it was called before the mocked repo instance here to reference. And then considering that this headline widget is an animated widget subclass or stateful widget, basically the state changed, right? Considering that the headline instance changed within this widget class. So we're basically redrawing the widget tree of this and just updating the article list with new ones, right? In this case, the new title here. So notice that it worked. All right, so next breakpoint here. And then the article within the list. All right, so next is our assertion, making sure that exists. And then the test results say 2 out of 2. All right, cool. So lastly, I was thinking for the third and final test, we could maybe, let's see, going back to our good old simulator here. So not much features in this app, obviously, as this is just a tutorial. But if you remember this bookmark button, right, basically displays a list of other media sources we could select from, like ABC News. So just to keep things simple, I won't go as far as like scrolling, the picker list here within this picker dialog, right? We'll just keep it simple. Where basically, if you notice that ABC News is always the top one here by default, right? And then basically expects us to go as far as scrolling down from ABC News. Okay, so just knowing that we default to Google News for each session, right? So remember that we mocked out article data from Google News. Basically, when we press the bookmark icon here, and then notice that ABC News is selected by default, as I just mentioned, and then press confirm. And then we'll be returned some ABC News data. Okay, so why don't we try doing just that? Okay, so I just copy and pasted what we just wrote for the wipe to refresh list view widget. So these will stay the same. And then with the exception of these, as we just recently included. Okay, so we just just being presented with this list here and this app bar with the app icon button here. We just want to fire a tap interaction to tap on this icon button, right? So how we do that is kind of like how we use the tap function up here. So we could just simply paste there, and then instead of finding by type, we could find by what's called find.by icon. If it'll let me. And then going over to our main.dart file. All right, so here's our app bar widget within the scaffolds widget. So basically it's an icon of collections, what's called the icons.collection bookmark here, right? So if you just copy and paste that, all right, doesn't throw an error. So it'll ideally handle this logic and then basically represent of this, right? Which we want to make sure that the pending or scheduled animations or frames are fully rendered out before proceeding further, okay? And then similarly, how we handled making another second mocked out call, it's gonna be kind of similar, right? But with the exception of rendering out ABC News related data, right? Which basically looks something like this with an ABC News title here, and of course some article related or from the news source, right? So if I pull up my Postman here, so instead of using Google News as the query parameter here, we could pass in the ABC News ID or source ID. It's basically ABC-news. And then here's a list of responses from them, all right? So we could copy and paste some of the relevant parts there. Before I forget, the source ID will be passing into this get call. Will not be we will not be using it from the cached source ID, right? In this case, Google News from shared purposes. So let's get rid of this. In this case, it's a string of the source ID -abc, or yeah, abc-news. And then the response, maybe change the title to something like ABC News. Let's leave that test article title there. Why not ABC News there? And then within the source objects we have here, basically takes in an ID and name. So based on postman here, it'll just look something like this. Could just copy and paste it here. And then the name, so human readable format. So ABC News, and then the URL could be abcnews.com, because why not? All right. So that's the second mocked out call. And then going to our main.dart widget file here. Basically, the on press callback is what shows the picker dialog, right? So if I jump down to the show picker dialog function here, it renders out some list of sources, right? Then basically for this picker, it has a onConfirm callback function here. All right, so each time the confirm button's pressed, we have a function down here that basically makes the get call here, right, for the news API mocked out instance. So again, we want to call this before we even get this far. Okay, so we can make the tap interaction. Right, so this will basically be a text widget, right? So we could tap by finding by that text widget. So find out by text. Oh, yeah, it's just text. And then confirm. And then pump and settle to make sure it's fully rendered out. I could just type it out. All right. And then once that confirm button is pressed, these lines will fire. Okay, so once that's pressed, or the confirm button is pressed, that's when the ABC News articles are returned. And then we can make our assertion here. So similar to what we had in our previous test, we could find by text. And then by the article title, finds one widget. Okay, and then that should do it. So let's see if it really works out in our favor. Okay, respective breakpoints there, then our breakpoints here. All right, so as always, I'll explain as we go. Yeah, sorry, I just threw a lot out at you guys, but can I figure out an easier way to say so? All right, so this is the second test ran. Not sure what probably has the same name. Let me change this really quick to something like select different news source from picker dialog widget. All right, let's try this. There we go. All right, so our initial mock get call here. The initial widget pumps. All right, so here's our article, our mocked out article from Google News. Okay, and then the template assertions. All right, and then basically tapping the icon or the app bar icon button at the top right. All right, so notice that onPress callback was fired off, so that's when we display the picker dialog. And then notice that the new picker will be shown, hence the show dialog function down here. Alright, so pump and settle, make sure that's fully rendered out. And then our second mocked out call, in this case, now will be passing in the ABC News source ID with a mocked out response of ABC News related article data. And then we tap the confirm button, remember? So it defaults to ABC News. And then notice that the callback's fired off here. Okay, and then the mocked get call. Alright, so notice that we have the source ID of ABC News instead of Google News this time. Alright, pump and settle. Make sure that the loaded list of ABC News data is fully rendered out in this list widget. And then the change in state. That's the articles, and there it is. Notice that given this source instance here, we have the ID and name of ABC News, and then the mocked out data for title, URL, whatnot. And then just like before, just fire out the remaining debug breakpoints. Alright, and then let that get built for the list tiles, and then the assertion. Alright, and then the test results say pass. Alright guys, that's all I had for this part of the series. And then the next part of the series will be covering integration testing, so get excited for that. But until next time guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.